In November 1945, millions of people across Britain watched Princess Diana sit in front of a television camera and speak openly about the collapse of her marriage. To viewers at the time, the meaning seemed straightforward. A princess who had spent years inside one of the world's most famous families was finally telling her side of the story. She spoke about loneliness, adultery, royal pressure, and the future of Prince Charles. But the public could not see how that interview had been obtained. That part of the story would take more than 25 years to fully emerge. An independent investigation later established that BBC journalist Martin Bashir had used deceptive methods, including fake bank statements, while attempting to gain access to Diana through her brother, Charles Spencer. When those findings became public in 2021, Prince William did something unusual. He spoke directly about his parents' marriage. William argued that the failures surrounding the interview had contributed significantly to his mother's fear, isolation, and paranoia, and had worsened the relationship between his parents. That statement changed the question. The Panorama interview did not create Charles and Diana's unhappy marriage. By 1995, they had already separated. Their private problems had become international news. Charles had already admitted adultery. Diana had secretly cooperated with a best-selling biography. The marriage was already broken. So the more difficult question is not whether one journalist destroyed it. The question is, what happens when a marriage that is already collapsing becomes valuable to everyone outside it? Because by the middle of the 1990s, Charles and Diana's relationship was no longer simply a struggle between husband and wife. It involved the monarchy, newspapers, broadcasters, advisors, photographers, biographers, and millions of people who had become emotionally invested in two people they had never met. Once that happened, the line between documenting the crisis and influencing it became dangerously thin. To understand why, it helps to begin with the institution surrounding the marriage. The British monarchy is often discussed as a family, but it is also a constitutional institution. The monarch represents continuity. The heir carries expectations about the future. Senior members perform public duties on behalf of the crown. Marriage inside that system, therefore, has two lives. There is the private relationship, and there is the public role. For Charles, the eldest son of Queen Elizabeth II, marriage was never entirely private. He was expected to become king. His wife would become Princess of Wales, and, if the marriage survived, would likely stand beside him at the centre of the monarchy. Diana Spencer appeared to fit the role. She came from an aristocratic family with long-standing royal connections. She was young, photogenic, and initially seemed well-suited to the traditions surrounding the crown. When their engagement was announced in February 1981, the reaction was enormous. One moment from that announcement would later be replayed thousands of times. Asked whether they were in love, Diana answered immediately. Charles gave a more complicated answer, ending with his famous qualification about what being in love meant. That exchange has often been treated as proof that the marriage was doomed from the beginning, but one awkward sentence cannot explain an entire relationship. The more revealing issue was the difference between the two people entering it. Charles was 32. Diana was 19 when the engagement was announced, and 20 when they married. He had spent his life preparing for a public role governed by protocol, hierarchy, and duty. She was being introduced to that world at extraordinary speed. On July 29, 1981, they married at St. Paul's Cathedral before a global television audience. The images became part of royal mythology. The carriage, the uniform, Diana's wedding dress, the balcony, the crowds. It looked like the perfect royal beginning. But spectacle could not solve compatibility. Diana entered a family with routines and expectations that had existed long before she arrived. Charles married a woman whose relationship with the public would soon become far more powerful than almost anyone had anticipated. There was also the unresolved presence of Camilla Parker Bowles. Camilla had been important in Charles's life before his marriage to Diana. Decades of reporting have examined the relationship in great detail, sometimes with more confidence than the evidence allows. What is firmly established is that Diana came to see Camilla as central to the breakdown of her marriage, and Charles later acknowledged committing adultery after. In his description, The marriage had already irretrievably broken down. But the marriage cannot be understood only as a triangle. Another tension became visible during Charles and Diana's 1983 tour of Australia and New Zealand. Royal tours were important demonstrations of the monarchy's connection to Commonwealth countries. Charles was the heir to the throne, yet the crowds increasingly focused on Diana. People wanted to see her. Photographers followed her. Newspapers emphasized her clothes, expressions, humor, and interactions with ordinary people. Her public appeal was immediate and unusually intense. It would be too simple to claim that Charles merely resented her popularity. Historical evidence does not allow anyone to know every private reaction, but the structural problem was obvious. The future king was supposed to be the central figure. The public often preferred his wife. That mattered because modern monarchy depends heavily on symbolism and public confidence. The British sovereign does not rule in the political sense that medieval monarchs once did. Formal powers are heavily constrained by constitutional convention. Much of the monarchy's practical strength, therefore, comes from legitimacy, continuity, visibility, and trust. Popularity can become a form of influence, and Diana possessed it in extraordinary quantities. The institution benefited from her appeal. At the same time, that appeal gave her a degree of independence from traditional royal expectations. Over the following years, she developed a public identity that went beyond fashion or celebrity. She worked with AIDS patients at a time when fear surrounding HIV remained widespread. She supported causes involving homelessness, children, illness, and later landmines. Her physical warmth and direct style often contrasted with the more formal traditions of royal engagement. The public responded, but admiration outside the marriage could not repair what was happening inside it. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, the relationship had deteriorated badly, and at that point, the press discovered something important. The fairy tale had been profitable. The collapse of the fairy tale could be even more profitable. British tabloids competed fiercely for royal stories. Photographs of Diana carried enormous value. Private conversations became marketable. Former employees, friends, acquaintances, and anyone claiming access to royal life could become a potential source. The marriage was turning into an industry. That changed the balance of power. Diana was not simply a passive victim of that system. She learned how to use it. In 1992, Andrew Morton's book Diana, her true story presented a devastating portrait of life inside the marriage. It described Diana's unhappiness, her struggles with royal life, and her belief that the institution around her did not understand her. At the time, the extent of her personal cooperation was not publicly known. It later became clear that Diana had secretly answered questions on tape through an intermediary. That fact is important because it complicates the traditional image of Diana as someone who merely endured the media. She also recognized its power. Charles had the machinery of the royal institution around him. Diana had extraordinary public sympathy. The palace could manage protocol. It could manage schedules. It could manage titles. It could not easily manage affection. By December 1992, the marriage had reached the point where Prime Minister John Major announced in Parliament that the Prince and Princess of Wales were separating. For American viewers, the involvement of a Prime Minister may seem strange, but Charles was the heir to the throne, and the future of his marriage had constitutional implications. Separation did not mean divorce. Charles remained Prince of Wales. Diana remained Princess of Wales. William and Harry remained in the line of succession. The family was divided privately while still connected formally. That was an unstable arrangement. Neither side was completely free. The press interpreted every public appearance. Every friendship became potential evidence. Every interview could shift public sympathy. Then, in 1994, Charles made an extraordinary decision. He participated in a television documentary and interview conducted by Jonathan Dimbleby. When asked whether he had been faithful, Charles acknowledged adultery after the marriage had, in his account, irretrievably broken down. The future king had publicly admitted an affair for Diana that changed the media landscape. What had previously been disputed or reported through newspapers now had Charles's own confirmation. There are at least two reasonable ways to interpret what followed. One is personal. Diana may have felt an increased need to explain her own experience publicly after Charles had explained his. Another is institutional. Once both sides were using public communication to defend their positions, the conflict had moved beyond marital breakdown into a battle over reputation and the future image of the monarchy. Both interpretations can exist together, and while the public focused on Charles and Diana, a BBC journalist was trying to gain access to the princess. His name was Martin Bashir. He worked for Panorama, one of Britain's most respected current affairs programs. An interview with Diana would have been one of the biggest journalistic prizes in the world. But Diana was difficult to reach. She had strong reasons to distrust people around her. Her marriage had collapsed. Her private life had repeatedly appeared in newspapers. Secret telephone conversations involving members of the royal circle had reached the press. She had learned that people could profit from proximity to her. Into that atmosphere came Bashir. His route to Diana went through her brother, Charles Spencer. This is the point where later documentary evidence becomes critical. Bashir arranged for fake bank statements to be created. Graphic designer Matt Weisler produced the material after being asked to make the documents. He did not know the full purpose for which they would eventually be used. The statements were shown to Charles Spencer. They appeared to support claims that people connected to Diana or the Spencer family were receiving money in suspicious circumstances. The documents were false. The payments they appeared to show had not happened. That fact is no longer speculation. The later independent investigation established that Bashir had used deception. What the evidence does not prove is every claim Diana was told about the people around her. That distinction matters. Some fears may have grown from genuine experiences with the press. Others were reportedly intensified by false information. A person can have legitimate reasons for distrust and still be manipulated through additional falsehoods. Charles Spencer eventually introduced Bashir to Diana. That introduction created the opportunity for Panorama, but Diana's vulnerability to Bashir's approach makes more sense when viewed in the environment of 1995. She was separated from Charles. She had a difficult relationship with parts of the royal institution. Her privacy had repeatedly been breached. She was one of the most photographed women alive. Stories about her appeared constantly. Some were true, some were exaggerated, some were false. In that environment, the ability to distinguish a genuine threat from manipulation could become increasingly difficult. And this is why Bashir's methods matter even if the marriage was already finished emotionally. The unresolved question was not whether Charles and Diana were happy. They were not. The unresolved question was how the formal ending would happen. Would they remain legally married but separated? Would the arrangement continue for years? Would the monarchy tolerate an indefinite public conflict? Would negotiations remain private? Or would something force a final decision? On November 20, 1995, Panorama broadcast Diana's interview. The audience was enormous. Diana discussed her marriage with a level of openness rarely seen from a senior royal. She spoke about Charles and Camilla. She acknowledged her own relationship with James Hewitt. She discussed her struggles and isolation, and she questioned whether Charles would be comfortable with the responsibilities of kingship. The line most people remember concerns there being 3 people in the marriage, but constitutionally, the more important moment may have been Diana openly questioning the future of the heir. That changed the stakes. Charles was not simply her estranged husband. He was expected to become king. Diana was not merely an estranged wife. She was the mother of the next generation of heirs. Queen Elizabeth therefore faced a problem no ordinary parent could face. She was Charles's mother. She was also sovereign and gate. She was William and Harry's grandmother. And she was responsible for an institution whose stability depended partly on the public confidence surrounding its future. By late 1995, the separation had clearly failed to create stability. The conflict was still unfolding through television and newspapers. The Panorama interview made that contradiction difficult to sustain. Within weeks, Queen Elizabeth wrote to Charles and Diana, urging an early divorce. The divorce was finalized in August 1996. At this point, it becomes tempting to reduce the story to a simple chain. Fake statements led to Bashir. Bashir led to Panorama. Panorama led to divorce. But that is too absolute. Charles and Diana's marriage had been in serious trouble long before Bashir arrived. They had separated in 1992. Morton's book had already exposed the crisis. Charles had publicly admitted adultery in 1994. Diana had already participated in her own media strategy. So the evidence does not support the claim that Bashir created the marital breakdown, but saying his actions made no difference would also ignore the historical record. Panorama clearly became a major event in the final phase of the marriage. The deception used to secure access matters because it affected the circumstances under which Diana came to trust Bashir, and the interview itself intensified a situation that was already unstable. The stronger argument is therefore not that Bashir destroyed the marriage. It is that he entered a broken marriage at a critical moment and influenced the environment surrounding its final public collapse. After the divorce, Diana's official position changed. She remained Diana, Princess of Wales. She remained the mother of William and Harry, but she lost the style Her Royal Highness. To many people outside Britain, the distinction may sound ceremonial. Inside the royal system, it reflected formal rank. Her institutional status had changed. Her cultural power had not. In some ways, Diana became even more independent after the divorce. She concentrated on selected humanitarian causes and continued to attract extraordinary global attention. Her involvement in the campaign against landmines became one of the most memorable images of her later public life. She no longer stood beside the heir, yet she remained one of the most famous women on earth. That revealed another weakness in the old assumptions surrounding royal power. A title could be removed. Public emotional authority could not. Then, in August, 1997, Diana died after a car crash in Paris. Dodi Fayed and driver Henri Paul also died. Bodyguard Trevor Rees-Jones survived. The crash generated years of conspiracy theories. Those theories should not be confused with established evidence. Official investigations examined the circumstances extensively. The later British inquest concluded that Diana and Dodi were unlawfully killed through the grossly negligent driving of Henri Paul and the following paparazzi vehicles. That does not support a simplistic claim that the media deliberately killed Diana, but aggressive press pursuit clearly belongs to the broader history of her relationship with celebrity and journalism. Diana's connection with the media had always been complicated. She used publicity to support causes. She sometimes used journalists to communicate her position. Journalists profited from her. Photographers pursued her. Audiences consumed the images. It was a system in which attention, money, access, public sympathy, and intrusion reinforced one another. Her death transformed that uneasy relationship into a national crisis. Across London, enormous numbers of flowers were left outside royal residences. Crowds gathered. Public grief overwhelmed normal expectations of royal mourning. The royal family remained at Balmoral with William and Harry during the first days after Diana's death. Their decision was later criticised as emotionally distant, but there was another interpretation. William and Harry were 15 and 12. They had just lost their mother. Their grandmother believed they needed privacy away from television cameras. The conflict was therefore not simply between a cold monarchy and a grieving public. It was between two different ideas of responsibility. The royal family believed private grief should remain private. Large parts of the public wanted visible acknowledgement from the institution Diana had once represented. That difference nearly became a crisis of legitimacy. Even the flag above Buckingham Palace became symbolic. Traditional protocol surrounding the royal standard did not match public expectations after Diana's death. To people outside the institution, an empty flagpole or rigid adherence to custom could look like indifference. The monarchy eventually adapted. Queen Elizabeth returned to London and addressed the nation on television. She spoke as both sovereign and grandmother. The royal household changed its approach. The funeral followed. William and Harry walked behind Diana's coffin with Charles, Prince Philip, and Charles Spencer. That image became one of the defining royal images of the 20th century. For the boys, it was personal grief conducted in front of a global audience. For the monarchy, it was another reminder that royal family life could never be fully separated from public expectation. Charles Spencer's funeral address added another layer. He criticized the forces that had surrounded Diana and promised that her blood family would help protect William and Harry. The public response revealed how deeply sympathy for Diana had become intertwined with suspicion toward the institutions around her. But Panorama still remained part of Diana's legacy. For years, the interview was treated primarily as a journalistic triumph and an extraordinary act of royal disclosure. Questions existed about how Bashir had obtained it, but the full story had not been established. The BBC had conducted an internal inquiry in 1996. That inquiry did not uncover the failures that would later be documented. Matt Wiesler had raised concerns. Charles Spencer retained records connected to his meetings with Bashir, but the controversy largely faded from mainstream attention. Meanwhile, clips from Panorama continued shaping the public memory of Diana. Her words entered documentaries, biographies, anniversary programs, and countless discussions of Charles and Diana's marriage. Diana herself could never revisit the circumstances of the interview. That is what made the events of 2020 and 2021 so important. Charles Spencer again raised concerns and provided evidence connected to Bashir's conduct. The BBC commissioned an independent investigation led by Lord Dyson, a former senior judge. His report was published in May 2021. The findings were severe. Dyson concluded that Bashir had acted deceitfully and had seriously breached BBC editorial standards in obtaining the interview. He found that fake bank statements had been used as part of Bashir's effort to gain access through Charles Spencer. The report also criticised the BBC's earlier investigation. It concluded that the corporation had failed to properly examine what had happened. This changed the historical meaning of Panorama. For 25 years, the interview had been remembered primarily for what Diana said. After Dyson, the question became how she had been brought into the interview in the first place. That does not make Diana's words automatically false. It does not erase Charles's adultery. It does not prove that every fear Diana had about the people around her was justified. It does not prove that Bashir invented the marital conflict, and it does not establish that Panorama caused every later tragedy in Diana's life, but it changes the ethical context. A person can speak sincerely while being manipulated into trusting the interviewer. An interview can contain truthful testimony and still have been obtained improperly. A marriage can already be broken while outside interference worsens the final stage. That is the distinction that transformed this from an old royal scandal into an institutional scandal. Then William spoke. His reaction was powerful because he was no longer simply the child who had lived through the marriage. He was an adult prince and future king. William said the interview had contributed significantly to his mother's fear, paranoia, and isolation. He also argued that it had worsened his parents' relationship and created a false narrative that had been commercialized for years. Harry issued his own statement and connected the episode to a wider culture of exploitation and unethical practices. Their responses gave the Dyson findings a different emotional weight. The controversy was no longer only about a journalist and a princess. It was about two sons learning that one of the defining media events of their mother's life had been obtained through methods later condemned by an independent investigation. And here the story changes again. William occupied a position Diana never did. He could condemn the failures surrounding his mother while remaining inside the monarchy. That distinction is important. Diana's conflict had often appeared to force a choice between personal independence and institutional belonging. William did not make the same choice. He criticized the BBC without rejecting the institution he is expected to inherit. That suggests a different model of royal survival. Institutions do not always protect themselves by defending the past. Sometimes they protect themselves by acknowledging failure. The BBC faced exactly that problem. It apologized. It returned awards connected to Panorama. It compensated people affected by the scandal. It agreed that the interview should not be rebroadcast in full. A program once celebrated as an extraordinary journalistic achievement had become a symbol of institutional failure, but one question remains. How much did Bashir's deception actually change history? There are at least three reasonable interpretations. The first is that the deception materially accelerated the end of the marriage. Under this interpretation, Bashir intensified Diana's existing distrust at a vulnerable moment, gained access through false material, and secured an interview that pushed the monarchy toward a divorce it had previously avoided. There is evidence supporting important parts of that argument. The deception is established. The timing is established. William later said the interview worsened his parents' relationship, but no evidence can prove the alternate history. Nobody can know with certainty what Diana would have done without Bashir. The second interpretation is more skeptical. Charles and Diana had already separated. The marriage was already effectively over. Morton's book had already been published. Charles had already admitted adultery. From this perspective, Panorama changed the presentation and timing of the final chapter more than the final outcome. That interpretation also has strong evidence behind it. But timing matters. History is not only about whether an event eventually happens, it is also about how it happens and under what pressure. The third interpretation may be the most revealing. Perhaps the most important story is not that one journalist changed one marriage. Perhaps the real story is that the marriage had become vulnerable to manipulation because so many institutions had incentives to turn private conflict into public material. The royal household wanted stability. Newspapers wanted circulation. Broadcasters wanted exclusives. Photographers wanted valuable images. Diana wanted her experience understood. Charles wanted his position explained. The public wanted intimate access to people whose constitutional role traditionally depended on distance. Those incentives collided. In that environment, Bashir's misconduct was not the beginning of the crisis. It was the clearest, documented example of what could happen once access to the royal marriage became a prize. That is why the story still matters. The media environment surrounding today's royal family is even faster than the one Diana faced. Social media can transform speculation into worldwide controversy within hours. Images travel instantly. Anonymous claims can move across platforms before anyone involved has responded. A private disagreement can become international content overnight. The lesson from Panorama is not that journalists should stop examining the monarchy. A constitutional institution requires scrutiny. Serious reporting matters. The lesson is that scrutiny and manipulation are not the same thing. Royal journalism occupies an unusual position. Members of the royal family are public figures. Their official duties, finance, public conduct, and institutional decisions can deserve investigation. But their celebrity also creates enormous commercial demand for private material that may have little constitutional importance. Both categories are often presented simply as royal news. Diana lived at the point where those categories became almost impossible to separate. Her marriage mattered constitutionally because Charles was the heir. It mattered emotionally because two people were deeply unhappy. It mattered commercially because millions of people wanted every detail. It mattered personally because William and Harry were children living inside the conflict. And it mattered institutionally because the monarchy's future image was tied to the family involved. Reducing the story to Charles against Diana, therefore, misses the larger lesson. Charles made choices for which he was responsible. Diana made choices for which she was responsible. The established misconduct of Bashir does not erase either person's agency. Their agency does not excuse the misconduct. Those truths can coexist. The monarchy also cannot be reduced to a single villain called the palace. Queen Elizabeth, Charles, Diana, advisors, private secretaries, and other members of the household had different duties and interests. Large institutions rarely act with one mind. The BBC scandal demonstrates the same point. Bashir was responsible for his actions. But Dyson's findings also raised questions about how the BBC handled concerns after those actions became known internally. That distinction between individual failure and institutional failure is central to the story. Both the monarchy and the BBC depend heavily on trust. Neither survives on legal authority alone. When that trust is damaged, the instinct to defend reputation can become dangerous. Sometimes an institution must choose between protecting yesterday's image and protecting tomorrow's legitimacy. William's statement can be understood in that context. He was defending his mother, but he was also showing how the next generation of monarchy could confront documented failure. The deeper emotional consequence lies with William and Harry themselves. They experienced their parents' separation as children. They experienced their mother's death under intense public scrutiny. More than 20 years later, they learned through an independent investigation that one of the most famous interviews of her life had been secured through deceptive methods. That history should not be used to explain every later decision either brother has made. But both men have repeatedly spoken about their mother's relationship with the media, and they have responded to that legacy very differently. William remained within the working monarchy. Harry eventually stepped back and moved abroad with his family. Those paths should not be reduced to a competition over who understood Diana better. They show something more human. The same trauma can produce different ideas about protection. For William, the answer has involved remaining inside the institution while attempting to control the boundary between public duty and private family life. For Harry, greater distance became part of the answer. Both choices emerged from a royal generation that had watched private family pain become public entertainment. That may be the longest legacy of Charles and Diana's marriage. Not simply the divorce, not simply Panorama, The deeper legacy was the transformation of the monarchy's understanding of media power. Before Diana, royal publicity could still be imagined as something controlled through formal access and ceremonial appearances, and relationships with established newspapers and broadcasters. Diana showed that one individual member of the royal family could develop a direct emotional connection with the public, strong enough to compete with institutional messaging. The marital conflict showed that competing narratives from within the same family could destabilize the monarchy's image. The crisis after Diana's death demonstrated that public emotion could force the crown to adapt traditions that suddenly appeared disconnected from the country, and the Dyson investigation demonstrated that even a famous historical narrative could be reassessed when new evidence emerged. For 25 years, Panorama was remembered as Diana's great television confession. After 2021, it had to be remembered in two ways at once. It was still the moment when Diana spoke openly about her marriage, but it was also an interview obtained through methods that failed basic journalistic standards. One truth does not erase the other. If Diana had never met Bashir, Charles and Diana might still have divorced. The evidence strongly suggests the marriage was already beyond repair. If Panorama had never existed, the conflict between Diana and the monarchy would not simply have disappeared. The adultery was real. The separation was real. The media battle was already underway. But history is shaped by more than inevitable outcomes. It is shaped by timing, pressure, information, trust, access, and decisions made by people who believe certain things to be true. That is where the fake documents matter. Not because a forged page magically destroyed a royal marriage, but because false information entered an already unstable environment at a critical moment. Diana then participated in an interview that became one of the most consequential broadcasts in modern royal history. The interview did not create the crisis. It became part of the crisis. That distinction is less dramatic than a conspiracy theory. It is also more credible. Conspiracy theories depend on the idea that one hidden actor controls events. The history of Charles and Diana suggests something more complicated. Sometimes history changes because many people pursue different interests inside a system that rewards escalation. A newspaper wants circulation. A broadcaster wants access. A princess wants to be heard. A prince wants to defend his position. An institution wants stability. A photographer wants the image everyone else missed. An audience wants more. No single motive controls the outcome. Together, those motives create an environment in which restraint becomes increasingly difficult. That environment surrounded Charles and Diana until their marriage was no longer entirely theirs. It belonged partly to newspapers, to television, to photographers, to royal advisors, to commentators, and finally, to the public. The strongest conclusion supported by the evidence, therefore, sits between two extremes. Martin Bashir did not create the failure of Charles and Diana's marriage, but the deception surrounding Panorama was not irrelevant. It entered the story at a critical moment, intensified an atmosphere of distrust, helped secure an interview with major institutional consequences, and became part of the final phase of one of the most consequential royal marriages of the modern era. The Dyson investigation did not rewrite every fact. It changed the context around one of the most important events, and that is why William's 2021 response matters so much. A child who witnessed the collapse became an adult participant in its historical reassessment. The boy who had lived inside Diana's final years became the heir, publicly arguing that part of the story the world had consumed for decades had been created through serious journalistic failure. William cannot know what would have happened without Panorama. Neither can historians. Counterfactual history has limits, but one conclusion is now possible that viewers in November 1995 could not have reached. They believed they were watching Diana give an extraordinary interview. They did not know they were also watching the end product of a journalistic process that would take a quarter of a century to properly investigate. Understanding that does not remove Diana's responsibility for what she chose to say. It restores the circumstances surrounding the choice, and perhaps that is the most useful way to understand the entire Charles and Diana story. Royal history is often reduced to personalities: the dutiful queen, the unhappy prince, the wounded princess, the rebellious son, the loyal heir. But personalities operate inside systems. Institutions shape the choices people have. Media shape how those choices are understood. Money shapes the value of access. Public sympathy shapes power. And when family, monarchy, journalism, celebrity, and commerce collide. The truth rarely belongs entirely to one side. So the final question is not simply whether Charles and Diana would have divorced without Martin Bashir. No surviving evidence can answer that with certainty. The more important question is this: when a marriage is already collapsing, and a broadcaster uses deception to obtain access to one person inside it, is the broadcaster still merely documenting events, or has it become one of the forces shaping them? That question extends far beyond Princess Diana. It matters whenever journalists cover vulnerable public figures. It matters whenever institutions investigate their own failures. And it matters whenever audiences are given a dramatic story without being shown everything that happened outside the camera frame. If you value carefully researched royal stories that separate established evidence from speculation, subscribe for more deep dives into the history behind the headlines. And in the comments, consider this distinction. Was Panorama mainly the record of a royal marriage that had already ended emotionally? Or did the methods used to obtain it make the BBC an active participant in how that marriage finally ended publicly? More than 25 years later, that remains the question at the centre of the story. There is a problem inside the modern British monarchy that no palace ceremony can easily solve. King Charles III can invite his younger son into a royal residence. He can make time for a private meeting. He can choose a quieter setting away from cameras and public ceremony, but he cannot simply order Truss to return. For Prince Harry, returning to Britain has become closely connected to a question he has discussed publicly for years: security. Since Harry and Meghan, Duchess of Sussex, stepped back from senior royal duties in 2020, the arrangements surrounding his protection in the United Kingdom have become the subject of legal disputes, public arguments, and intense media attention. For Charles, the issue carries another complication. He is Harry's father, but he is also the king. His personal wishes exist alongside government procedures, security assessments, palace responsibilities, and the need to protect the stability of the institution he inherited from Queen Elizabeth II. That is why reports and speculation about a possible private reunion at Balmoral are more significant than they first appear. The real question is not whether Charles and Harry can sit in the same room. They have been in the same places since the royal rupture began. The harder question is whether they can build a new relationship when the structure that once connected them no longer exists. And there is an important distinction to make from the beginning. The public record confirms a long-running security dispute and a serious breakdown in royal relationships, but dramatic accounts of secret negotiations, private ultimatums, exact conversation, or personal reactions should not automatically be treated as established fact. There is no need to invent those scenes. The documented conflict is powerful enough on its own. To understand it, we have to return to 2020, when Harry and Meghan announced that they intended to step back as senior members of the royal family. The decision transformed far more than their public schedules. A working royal occupies a specific place inside the monarchy. Working members carry out official engagements on behalf of the sovereign, their staff, travel, security environment, public duties, and access to royal resources operate within an institutional framework. Harry and Meghan wanted greater independence from that framework. The eventual arrangement gave them freedom to pursue a separate life. But it also changed the relationship between the couple and the institution. Harry remained a prince. He remained a member of the royal family. He remained the son of the future king, but he was no longer a working royal. That difference is central to everything that followed. Security soon became one of the most difficult consequences. For American viewers, royal security can be confusing. Because the British monarchy combines family relationships with public institutions, it is easy to imagine that the king personally decides who receives police protection. Protective security decisions involve government authorities, professional assessments, and formal procedures. Harry's disputes over his security arrangements entered the British legal system, making clear that the issue was not simply a private argument between a father and his son. Charles can care about Harry's safety without possessing unlimited personal authority over the security system. Harry can also believe that the arrangements available to him are inadequate, without that belief automatically proving that Charles has personally rejected him. The difference between those two ideas is crucial. Harry has repeatedly connected security with his willingness to bring his family to Britain. Whatever view people take of his legal arguments, the concern itself cannot responsibly be dismissed as an invented excuse. Harry has described protection as a serious issue, but recognizing that does not automatically mean every solution he might prefer can be delivered by his father. This is where the conflict becomes more difficult than a typical royal feud. There is no single decision that makes the entire problem disappear. If you appreciate royal stories that distinguish documented events from speculation, while still examining the power struggles and family conflicts behind the headlines, subscribe, because the history behind this dispute explains far more than any imagined conversation inside a palace. Before the rupture, Harry occupied a very different position. He had spent 10 years in the British Army and completed 2 tours in Afghanistan. His military service became an important part of his public identity, and he later created the Invictus Games for wounded, injured, and sick service personnel and veterans. For years, Harry was one of the most recognizable members of the working monarchy. His charitable work existed within a broader royal structure, but his relationship with royal life became increasingly complicated. His marriage to Meghan in 2018 attracted enormous global attention. The couple later spoke publicly about the pressure they experienced from the press and about their dissatisfaction with aspects of life inside the royal institution. Harry and Meghan eventually established a new life in California. That created a contradiction that has never completely disappeared. He left the institution as a working representative. His access to certain institutional structures changed. Family status remained, while institutional status changed. And much of the conflict since 2020 can be understood through the tension between those two realities. This is also why the word reconciliation can be misleading. For an ordinary family, reconciliation might mean arranging a private dinner, discussing old grievances, apologizing, and trying to move forward. For the royal family, almost nothing is that simple. A private meeting involving the sovereign still exists within a world of schedules, staff, security, protocol, and intense public scrutiny. A photograph can become evidence of supposed forgiveness. An absence can become evidence of supposed hostility. A security arrangement can be interpreted as a victory for one side. Often, those interpretations go much further than the evidence allows. Charles and Harry are especially vulnerable to this problem because so much of their relationship has already entered the public record. Harry and Meghan appeared in a documentary series. Legal proceedings have revealed other parts of his battles with British institutions and the press. Charles, by contrast, has generally avoided responding publicly in detail to his son's personal allegations. Harry's perspective is extensively documented in his own words, and whenever one side speaks while another remains largely silent, speculation fills the gap. Silence cannot tell us exactly what Charles thinks about Harry. It cannot prove whether he is angry, disappointed, hopeful, frustrated, or some combination of those emotions. It cannot establish what father and son have said privately. What can be observed is the monarchy's broader communications strategy. The institution generally avoids conducting family disputes through direct public confrontation. That approach is consistent with a much older royal culture of restraint. The British sovereign operates within a constitutional monarchy. The king is head of state. But political power is exercised through elected government and established constitutional arrangements. The monarchy therefore depends heavily on continuity, symbolism, neutrality, and public confidence. It is part of how the institution protects itself. But an approach that helps protect an institution does not necessarily repair a family. And this is where Charles's two identities begin to collide. As Harry's father, he has a personal relationship with his son. As king, Charles represents something much larger than himself. They become harder to separate when a personal dispute touches security, royal status, public money, government procedure, or the reputation of the monarchy. He wanted independence from the working royal system. That independence gave him greater control over his career and public life. But independence also meant that some arrangements connected to his former position could change. That does not mean every concern he raises is unreasonable. It means independence has institutional consequences. This is the part of the debate that often disappears when the story is reduced to two competing camps. One side sees Harry primarily as a son protecting his wife and children after years of intense press scrutiny. Another sees him as someone who left royal responsibilities while continuing to expect advantages connected with royal status. Both interpretations contain arguments worth examining. Harry did not become an ordinary private citizen when he left royal duties. Security risks do not necessarily disappear when an official role ends. But it is also reasonable for security arrangements to be reconsidered when someone's official duties and circumstances change. That is why the issue cannot simply be reduced to love. A father can care about his son while lacking the power to personally determine every government security decision. A son can care about his father while believing that returning under certain arrangements creates unacceptable risk. And when both are true, a family meeting does not automatically solve the problem. Few places carry more emotional significance for the modern royal family. The Scottish estate was closely associated with Queen Elizabeth II throughout her reign. Balmoral offered the family a degree of privacy away from the formal atmosphere of Buckingham Palace and many public duties in London. It was also where Elizabeth died on September 8. 2022. That gives Balmoral a special place in the family history of Charles, William, Harry, and their relatives. It is easy to understand why the possibility of a private reconciliation there attracts attention, but a powerful setting is not proof that a particular meeting, summit, ultimatum, or negotiation occurred, exactly as described in dramatic reports. Royal coverage frequently turns uncertain information into highly specific narratives. The language can make a story sound more certain than the evidence actually is. Responsible analysis has to separate those layers. What is clear is that Charles and Harry have experienced a serious relationship breakdown. Harry has publicly expressed concerns about bringing his family to Britain. Father and son have also had contact since Harry's departure from royal duties. What cannot automatically be known is every condition discussed privately, or the exact reasons behind every meeting that did or did not happen. Yet Balmoral still helps explain the problem because it forces several different systems into the same story. For Charles, a meeting involves a personal relationship, but also the realities surrounding the sovereign. For security professionals, protection has to be assessed through formal processes. For the media, almost every detail can become symbolic. That is why something as practical as transportation can suddenly become part of a much larger argument about status. A change in procedure becomes evidence of supposed victory. The practical and symbolic become almost impossible to separate. Harry's personal history makes the security issue even more sensitive. His mother, Diana, Princess of Wales, experienced extraordinary press attention throughout her adult life. Her death in Paris in 1997 was one of the defining events of Harry's childhood. It would be wrong to claim that Diana's death explains every decision Harry has made as an adult. No outsider can reduce a person's motivations to a single childhood trauma. But Harry himself has publicly connected his mother's experience with his concerns about the press and the protection of his own family. It helps explain why he may view security through a different emotional lens from people who see it merely as a technical arrangement. For Harry, according to his own public statements, questions of protection exist alongside his experiences with the media and his responsibilities toward Meghan and their children. Charles comes to the conflict from a very different direction. When Elizabeth II died after 70 years on the throne, Charles inherited an institution undergoing a major generational transition. The institution had to maintain continuity after losing the woman who had embodied the crown for most of the lives of millions of Britons. That creates pressures that have nothing to do with whether Charles personally loves his younger son. The king must think about the monarchy as an institution. Any major development involving Harry therefore generates questions beyond the family relationship. Would improved relations mean Harry was returning to royal duties? The answer to many of those questions could simply be no, but the fact that they are asked demonstrates the unusual burden carried by royal families. A father can invite his son without intending to change the monarchy. The public may still interpret the invitation as a royal decision. It also explains why the conflict should not be viewed as a simple choice between total reconciliation and permanent estrangement. There are many possibilities between those extremes. Charles and Harry can communicate without Harry returning as a working royal. They can meet without resolving every disagreement. They can improve their personal relationship while continuing to disagree about security. They can repair one part of the family relationship while other parts remain damaged. William's position matters for reasons that extend far beyond the widely reported breakdown in his relationship with Harry. He is expected eventually to inherit the monarchy. Charles now leads. That means he occupies two roles in this family dispute, and he represents the next generation of institutional authority. There is no reliable basis for assuming William secretly controls every decision Charles makes about Harry. Any arrangement involving Harry that depends entirely on Charles personally may eventually encounter a different reality under William. At the same time, a continuing fracture between the brothers could remain a public issue long after Charles's reign. The monarchy has to think beyond the present moment. Harry represents a famous branch of the family that remains permanently connected to the monarchy, even though he no longer serves as a working member. And this reveals one of the most important truths about Charles's power. A king can be powerful without being able to control his family. Charles cannot erase what has happened since 2020. He cannot prevent every private interaction from becoming public speculation. He cannot turn personal preference into government policy simply because he wears the crown. The monarchy gives him enormous symbolic authority. It does not give him unlimited authority over human relationships. Royal history has demonstrated that problem many times. Kings and queens can control ceremonies, appointments within their households, public appearances, and the tone of their reigns, and they cannot create trust through royal protocol. That limitation makes the Charles-Harry conflict more interesting than a simple story about who has greater power. Harry possesses something Charles cannot control: the ability to determine the terms on which he participates in his own family relationships. He cannot require the monarchy, the government, or security institutions to reorganize themselves entirely around those boundaries. But there is another factor that makes this conflict unusually difficult. Charles, Harry, and William do not disagree in private isolation. Even an attempt at privacy can create speculation precisely because the public cannot see what is happening. And that brings us to the turning point in the story. At first, the conflict appears to be about whether Harry's security concerns could prevent a reconciliation with Charles. But security and reconciliation are not the same problem. Even if Charles and Harry held a successful private meeting tomorrow, Harry's broader security dispute would not automatically disappear. And even if every security question were resolved tomorrow, years of family conflict would still remain. That distinction changes how the entire situation should be understood. Security may determine whether certain visits are practical. It cannot determine whether father and son trust one another. The family conflict now includes much more than protection arrangements. There was Harry and Meghan's departure from royal duties, and there was the deterioration of Harry's relationship with William. That is why the popular idea of one decisive royal summit may misunderstand the nature of the problem. But reconciliation after years of conflict rarely works that way. If Charles and Harry repair their relationship, the process is more likely to happen through a series of smaller decisions, perhaps disagreement without another public escalation, and everyone involved pays a price while it continues. For Harry, distance from Britain can affect how frequently he and his children interact with members of his wider family. That does not tell us how Harry privately feels about the trade-off. For Charles, an important family relationship remains publicly strained during his reign. Again, outsiders cannot responsibly claim to know his private emotional state. For William, the unresolved conflict may eventually become part of the family landscape surrounding his own reign. For the monarchy, the dispute remains a recurring story, capable of drawing attention away from official work. No invented palace source is necessary to understand those consequences. A concession from either side may not actually solve anything. Suppose Harry agreed to visit under an arrangement he considered inadequate, but if he believed his concerns had been ignored, the visit would begin with mistrust. Suppose unusual arrangements were created solely to ensure one meeting could occur, but those arrangements could not reasonably be repeated in the future, but the same dispute would return before the next visit. That is the weakness of solving structural disagreements with temporary exceptions. It cannot necessarily create a stable relationship. The conflict therefore cannot fairly be summarized as Charles refuses Harry or Harry refuses Charles. A better explanation is that several separate problems have become tangled together. There is also a media dimension that deserves serious consideration. Royal reconciliation is an extremely marketable story. A headline saying that father and son remain in limited private contact does not generate the same emotional reaction as a headline describing a secret peace summit on the verge of collapse. That does not mean reports of royal meetings are necessarily false. It means audiences should pay attention to the language used to describe them. Those terms can turn complicated family communication into a battle with winners and losers. Sometimes there is evidence for dramatic language. In this case, exaggeration is unnecessary because the documented facts already carry enormous